I'm Jeff Mease. This is Lennie's in the Bloomington Brewing Company. Lennie's is a restaurant that we started 23 years ago. Lennie's early on became a very popular restaurant, and we were very interested at the time in promoting these new craft beers that were mostly coming from the West Coast. Anchor Steam Brewing Company, Pete's Wicked Ale. Customers really liked them, and I really have always been intrigued and inspired, kind of fascinated with making things locally and with local brands and brands that you couldn't buy just anywhere. And in about 1993, I started learning more about craft breweries and the whole craft beer business. And we kind of got the crazy idea that we should try to start a brewery in Bloomington. At that time, Indiana laws weren't set up really right to allow craft breweries to exist. So I spent about a year of my life researching laws that had been changed in other states, and got some good help from the Association of Brewers out in Colorado and from the Indiana Restaurant Association. And over about a year's time, we got a bill introduced and passed in General Assembly that really got things opened up for craft breweries to be able to start and function well in Indiana. That was 1993, 1994, and in 1994 we opened the Bloomington Brewing Company. This is our original location right next to our restaurant, Lennie's. Let's go in and check out the brewery. It's a little noisy in here. Floyd is our head brewer. Floyd's been with the brewery about 15 years. He's right now cleaning a tank. We've just transferred our homegrown series. We make a little bit different beer every year, using only the hops that we grow out at our farm, Lush Farm. Floyd's also the head hop farmer out there. This year we had a really good crop. We got about 50 pounds of hops, and that all went into one beer. This is a 15-barrel brew house. Specific Mechanical built it in Vancouver, British Columbia. It's a great machinery. They're still building breweries today. Every brewery that you see anywhere, just about, is you can't buy these things off the shelf. You place an order, and the company fabricates it and builds it to your specifications. And it took about 4 months from the time we ordered this brew house to when we built it. This section is called the brew house in any brewery, and it essentially includes a mash tun and a boil kettle. This is the mash tun. Tun just means a vessel. Mashing is a very critical part of brewing beer. It's where we take malted barley and other grains, but in craft brewing, malted barley is the fundamental ingredient. We mill grain in a small room back here. Just break the grains open so that the water can penetrate into them. It comes through this auger and falls into the mash tun as it's mixing with hot water. Very specific temperature of water. We mash with about 152, 153 degree water, filtered water. The waters here in Bloomington, because we have a lot of limestone, are very, very good for brewing. The grain goes into the mash tun mixed with water. We end up with a mash that's 16 or 18 inches deep. And it looks a lot like, we aren't brewing here today so we can't see it, but it looks a lot like oatmeal. And once the grain gets into the mash tun, we let it rest for a period of time. And in that process, the enzymes from the malted barley are taking the long carbohydrate molecules and cutting them up into short sugar molecules. So what we start with is a starchy grain and a starchy liquid, but in about an hour, that liquid all becomes sweet. And at that point, it's called sweet brewer's wort. Through this panel, the brewer is able to move fluids going. There's Floyd there. Through this panel, the brewer is able to for brewing and for cleaning. And I got to stop and just say, you see all the you see the cleaning chemicals on the floor. Cleaning and sanitizing is really the fundamental part of brewing. We're in a race and a battle always against bacteria and wild yeast. Those things can give off flavors to beer and make the beer do all sorts of things that we don't want it to do. There's nothing, it's kind of a lesser known fact that nothing will grow in beer that's going to hurt you because of the low pH that the beer gets to during fermentation. But you can have beer still that doesn't taste right. It tastes bad if we allow wild yeast or bacteria to get into the process. So sanitizing is a huge part of the thing. But what we'll do once this mash is ready, once this wort is sweet, we'll divert it over into the boil kettle. BK number 1, these are federal laws say that we have to have every tank labeled in a certain way and defined by how much volume it will hold. This boil kettle is essentially just a great big pot. It's got a big gas-fired burner underneath it, and we'll boil that wort for about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on the kind of beer that we're making. In that boiling process, we're boiling off some volatiles that we don't want that also can create off flavors in beer. And we're also putting in hops in this period. Hops are the primary spice that's been used in beer for hundreds and hundreds of years. Hops are very bitter, have very bitter oils, and like apples, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of different varieties of hops, and the hop farming industry is coming up with new varieties all the time. It's pretty fascinating. We're getting a lot of hops now that are focused on aroma, hops that are used for that, not so much the bittering of beer, which is what they've always traditionally been used for, but that farmers are coming up with hop varietals that give these really beautiful piney and citrus aromas. Those kind of hops are typically used at the very, very end of the boil process. Just like if you want garlic aroma in your tomato sauce or whatever, you want to add that garlic just as you're finishing it. You get a nice aroma from it. But if you want a deep, really sharp garlic flavor, you'll add that early in the cooking process. Hops are very much the same way. Hops added very early in the boil will give us a very deep bitterness. Hops added at the end, or towards the end, will give a really nice aroma and a little bit of flavor, but mostly aroma. When we talk about IBUs in beer, the standard measurement of how bitter a beer is, the hops that go into the beginning of the boil really drive that IBU. You can add lots and lots of hops at the end of the boil that don't really contribute to IBUs, but can create a lot of nice hop flavor and aroma. So that's the boil process. Once the beer is finished boiling, several things take place. There's a lot of hops and proteins in the boil kettle now that we don't want to go into fermentation. So there's a very simple, old, traditional way. Any boil kettle creates what's called a whirlpool. We connect a hose here and recirculate the wort and just make a whirlpool for about 15 minutes. and that forces all these proteins and hop sediments into the center where they settle out, and that keeps them out of the fermenter. We don't want them in the fermenter because it's another thing that can create some flavors that we don't want. Once those solids settle out, we transfer this wort over to a fermenter. Now, yeast needs a very specific temperature to grow. If we put yeast into a hot wort, it'll just immediately kill the yeast. So we've got to get this fluid, this 600 gallons or so of fluid, from boiling all the way down to about 68 or 70 degrees before we add the yeast to it. It's a very important step because we don't want the beer. We want to chill the beer just as quickly as possible, and so the beer runs through this very simple machine here that's called a heat exchanger. We've got chilled water and chilled glycol, which is a refrigeration liquid, running through one side of all these plates. There's beer, hot wort, running through the other. And so from the intake to the outtake, the beer comes in at 210 degrees, comes out at 70 degrees, if everything's working right. And into these fermenters. These fermenters have conical bottoms, and that's really valuable as the beer is fermenting. We put in a little bit of yeast to get it going, but that yeast multiplies and multiplies and multiplies, and as it's multiplying, it consumes sugar. The effluent of the yeast is carbon dioxide and alcohol, which is what we're trying to create. And different strains of yeast, and again, there's many, many different varieties of yeast that are used in brewing, different strains. You'll hear about people refer to Belgian-style yeasts. And these are just yeasts that have essentially been domesticated in Belgium and give unique flavors to those beers. I'm sure 200 years from now, we may be finding, oh, this is an Indiana yeast strain, this is an Ohio yeast strain, this is a California yeast strain. Right now, the craft beer industry is very nascent here, but I don't doubt that that'll happen. We use a primary yeast strain for most of our beers. That's an English yeast strain, London Ale. It's referred to, and that's a beer that we think really gives a nice fruitiness to our pale ales, our ruby, our stout. But if we want to make a German-style beer like a Hefeweizen, or if we want to make a Belgian-style beer, we need to buy a yeast strain specific to those styles. And the yeast variety has a tremendous effect on the flavor of the beer. The beer remains in these fermenters for about 2 weeks. And at that point, the yeast is not putting off any more carbonation or any more fermentation. The beer kind of settles. The first 4 days that the yeast is in these tanks, it's just, if you could see through these tanks, it's roiling like this. There's so much activity, it's alive. After about 5 days, that dramatically subsides and the beer starts to settle. The yeast end up falling out of solution. They don't. Some of them die, some of them go dormant. We take the dormant yeast from one batch of beer, and we can save it for the next batch of beer. And we can typically go through about 8 to 12 generations of yeast before we need to buy a new yeast strain. There's several yeast companies in the United States that do this work in a laboratory and keep a strain going without mutation. If we try to use a yeast 100 times in a brewery, and some breweries do that, we don't have a laboratory here yet, so we're not able to just make sure that that yeast that we're putting in is exactly the same as what we started with. So we buy a new yeast strain, which is pretty typical in at this scale of brewing. After that, the beers go into what we call a bright tank, aging conditioning tank, or a bright tank. This is our bright tank right here. We also can bright beers in some of our serving tanks. This little thing you might notice here, there's an interesting story behind that. All these tanks are double walled. There's a wall on the outside, and then there's insulation and another stainless steel wall on the inside. In the against the tank on the inside, there are jackets called glycol jackets, and that gives chilled refrigeration liquid the ability to cycle through these tanks, and is chilled by a chiller that sits up in our attic there. This allows us to maintain the temperature of these tanks within a degree or so of where we want them. And the fermentation temperature is very, very specific and very, very critical to how the finished beer comes out. If we're 3 or 4 degrees off on our fermentation temperatures, the beer will definitely taste different. So we want to be really able to control the temperature. This is a tank that had sprung a leak, had a very small pinhole leak inside the inside wall of this tank, and we had to figure out where it was. So Floyd got out a stethoscope and ran around the tank until we heard a hiss when he had a little pressure in the tank, and we were able to cut in there and had somebody out to weld the inside of the tank, and we just put the piece back on. A lot of the work in a brewery, besides sanitizing, is just taking care of equipment. You've got a lot of moving parts, and a lot of stuff can go wrong, and does. After 3 weeks or so, our beers are ready. They've settled out, they're pretty clear. We don't filter our beers in the Bloomington Brewing Company, and we really think that commitment to not filtering really adds a lot of mouthfeel to our beers, a lot of good body, and also a lot of flavors. When you're filtering beer, pushing it through a filter medium or through a filter, you're holding out a lot of the particles in the beer that give flavor. We're all on draft at the Bloomington Brewing Company currently, and we're planning to get bottling, do our first small-scale bottling within a few months. We're not totally sure yet if we're going to be able to remain unfiltered. There's a lot of challenges to go into a bottle when you're unfiltered, but some of the best breweries in the world are doing it, and we're working on figuring out how to do it ourselves. It's really something we'd like to stay committed to. Once the beer is finished, you'll see brewer's hose on the floor. These are sanitary hose. They look a little dirty on the outside, but they're pristine and clean on the inside. And this is how, in any brewery, you'll find the beer gets moved around from point to point, from tank to tank. The beer that just came out of this tank this morning went into our cold room here, and I want to show you in there. In our cold room, we've got these big 15-barrel, 500-plus gallon tanks, and these will hold an entire batch of beer from out there. When we first started our brewery, we were only making about 3 or 4 beers at a time, but now we've got a lot more beers than that, and so you can see we've got the ability to put kegs underneath. This little design was a great thing that we saw out in Oregon at a brewery before we got started here. We thought it was such a great idea. It doesn't cost very much to make a walk-in cooler a couple feet taller. But you could imagine if this was a typical 8-foot walk-in, these tanks would fit, but you'd walk in here and have no space to move and no space for kegs. So getting them up off the floor is great. We can also gravity feed to our taps right here, which is a little more gentle on the beer, a little more natural process. These kegs right here are called firkins, or cask conditioned beers. They're made a little bit differently. They're pulled off a beer engine instead of being pushed by CO2, which is the way just practically any beer is done. Is we say it's pushed by CO2. These beers aren't pushed, they're pulled out with essentially a beer engine, which is a beer pump. This is the way beer was handled for centuries when beer was kept in the basement of a pub at cellar temperature and pumped up to the bar by means of a beer engine.